Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Downtown Author Stage. Thank you to BookExpo America for hosting us here today. My name is Ron Hogan. I am the founder of Beatrice.com, a website dedicated to books and writers. And I'm pleased to be moderating a little Q&A session with the four of the authors of this year's Buzz titles. From my left here is Rachel Joyce, the author of The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry from Random House. Vaddey Ratner is the author of In the Shadow of the Banyan from Simon & Schuster. Susannah Cahalan is the author of Brain on Fire, a memoir from the Free Press. And Antoine Wilson is the author of Panorama Semi from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. And because we have a short session, I'm going to start things off and sort of plunge everybody into the same question, which is that if you guys can just tell us a little bit about yourselves and sort of about the core of your books.
That's the beginning.
That's the beginning. Just
Great.
jump right in.
Well, I'm Rachel Joyce. I'm from England. And I've been writing for radio for about 16 years, but this is my first book. And it's based on a play I wrote a very long time ago for my dad when he was dying. And the story is of a man who receives a letter from an old friend who he hasn't seen for about 20 years to say that she is dying, and he decides very impulsively and with no appropriate equipment to walk in order to try and save her life, is the idea. So he walks the length of England with the shoes he's wearing. Is the idea.
My name is Vaddey Ratner. My debut novel, In the Shadow of the Banyan, is set in Cambodia in the mid-1970s during a time of political upheaval. It charts the journey of a young girl and her aristocratic family as they navigate the landscape of war and revolution. It is based on my own family's experiences during the Khmer Rouge regime. It's, while the context is, of course, war and revolution and genocide, the story is one of love and hope and the power of storytelling as a means of survival.
My name is Susannah Cahalan. I am a reporter for The Post. I've been there for 10 years, and my memoir, Brain on Fire, is about a medical nightmare that happened to me in 2009. It's terrible. Basically, it was filled with hallucinations, paranoia, at the worst, kind of catatonia, almost comatose-like state. And it's about kind of living through that and not remembering most of it, and kind of writing about it and the relationships that came about because of that experience. I got far closer with my father, and I also got very close with my boyfriend, who I'm still with now, who stuck by me that whole time. So it's a story of kind of a medical nightmare and kind of the beauty that comes out of very terrible things.
My name is Antoine Wilson. My novel is called Panorama City, and it's narrated by a 28-year-old, very tall, very open-hearted, illiterate guy named Oppen Porter, who likes to ride his bicycle around and wears binoculars all the time. And he finds himself at age 28 on what he believes is his deathbed after getting hit by a truck. And he uses this opportunity to narrate into cassette tapes everything he thinks his unborn son is going to need to know in order to become a man of the world. So the novel, that's the form of the novel, and essentially most of what he talks about is 40 days and 40 nights he spent down in Panorama City, which is in the San Fernando Valley, and represents his experience in the real world, so to speak.
Great. Thank you, guys. And now I'm going to get into a little more detail with each of you about some of the things that are going on in your stories and about the creation of your stories. Rachel, I know that this is your first novel after several radio plays that you've written. And if I understand correctly, The Unlikely Pilgrimage began as a radio play originally.
It did.
And I would love to hear a little bit more about sort of like what it was like for you making the transition from writing radio drama to writing prose fiction. And, you know, was this something that you'd been thinking about for a while, and how did it go?
I mean, I've been writing prose since I was very small, but I just hadn't ever really shown it to anyone. And then I began writing plays. I sort of moved into it because I worked as an actress for a very long time, and then I moved into writing plays. And then I was writing more and more, and then about a couple of years ago, I thought what I really, really want to do is take time out and write this book, which is what I did. So I then began pretending that I was writing radio plays when I was writing Harold, and it became sort of more and more compulsive and obsessive. But it was also, it was sort of, for me, it was an act of faith in that you know, when I write for radio, you know that there's a place that your play is going, whereas when I was writing a book, there was just no guarantee that anybody was going to get it or, you know, want to read it, or that I would get to the end. So the book became, for me, about my journey through writing a book.
Wonderful. And Vaddey, although this is a novel, it's very much based on your own experiences during the Khmer Rouge period. And one of the things that comes through in the author note at the end is that you yourself are, in fact, a member of the Cambodian royal family. And you talk about, in the end, years later, that you had an encounter, that you had an opportunity to meet the king. And I would love to hear about that experience and sort of the emotional impact that that sort of reunion had on you.
My great-great-grandfather, King Sisavat, reigned in the early 1900s. My father was not only a prince, but an intellectual, a very educated man. This meant for us a life of great privilege before the revolution, but during the Khmer Rouge period, it marked us for death. Having survived that experience, it was particularly poignant for me to return many decades later to the royal palace for an audience with the king. Sitting in the same hall where my father had sat many times before, I spoke his name. Then I found that I could hardly speak anymore. For all that he suffered, I wish he could know that I would survive, that I would be here to take his place, that he would not be forgotten. So In the Shadow of the Banyan is a story of his continuation as well as mine. It is a love story, a tale that attests to the unbreakable bond between ourselves and those we love.
And Susannah, in your introduction, you mentioned that one of the challenges of writing this memoir for you is that you don't actually remember a lot of what you went through. And I would love to talk a little bit about how your experience as a journalist really is crucial to the writing of this memoir.
Oh, it was definitely crucial. I called it my lost month. It was most of the time I was in the hospital. I don't remember anything. The things I do remember are hallucinations. I believed that I could age my doctor with my mind. I believed I was on the TV. I mean, nothing that was actually real. That's my reality during that lost month. So I was able to, using skills I learned as a reporter, going through medical records, interviewing tons of people, nurses, my family, doctors, everyone I could get my hands on. I interviewed to try to retrace this person that was in the hospital for a month that I have no access to. So that was definitely a challenge, but it was in a way easier to write it than some of the parts that I wrote from my very first person part, because in a way I was distanced enough to write almost objectively about that person there, and it was easier in a way. It's kind of strange.
And Antoine, as you mentioned in your description of the book, this is essentially a character narrating his story into a tape recorder. And so voice is obviously a very crucial part of that. And I would, love to ask you about finding the voice of Oppen, and how did that voice come to you, and how did you sort of like know when you had his voice down?
Well, finding Oppen's voice was a long process, but the sort of central thing that allowed it to happen was he's positioned essentially like his father has died at the beginning of the book, and his son is about to be born. So he's in this sort of in-between generations position through the course of the book. When I began writing the book, my son was about to be born. So, I mean, I literally started sketching the book several months before my son was born. And I hadn't yet sort of come across this idea of how it was going to be narrated, but it developed as my sort of son came into the world. And by the time I was finished with the book 4 years later, my father had died. So in this sort of strange way, I found myself in a similar position as Oppen, sort of feeling like I was the bridge between two generations. That, thematic layer is what ended up driving a lot of the voice, the voice which engages in repetition and other sort of spoken language kind of stuff that I wanted to put on the page. But sort of like, the emotional core of the voice came from being in the same position as him. And also, I thought, before I had a kid, I thought, this is gonna be great. Everything's gonna slow down. I'll see the world through his eyes, right? Which doesn't happen, right? Instead, you see like all the dangers coming at him as you try to protect him from, or whatever. But what did happen is sort of on a strange emotional echo level, I felt like I was getting some emotional echoes of my own childhood. And so I ended up not seeing the world through his eyes as much as through my own childhood eyes, which definitely fed into Oppen's open worldview and philosophy, I guess. So, everything went into there. It's like a Vitamix.
Thanks. And it looks like we have some time for some questions from you folks in the audience. So if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask of our authors, just raise your hand and I'll come up with the microphone for you. And okay, well, while you're thinking about some questions, I do have some other things that I can talk to each of you about. Rachel, in The Unlikely Pilgrimage, Harold Fry walks from Kingsbridge, which is at the southernmost tip of England, up to Berwick upon Tweed, which is way up north on the coast near the Scottish border.
Yeah.
Now, I'm assuming that you didn't research this entire trip on foot yourself, but you know a lot of the places that he hits along the way, and let's maybe talk about how you know some of these places.
When I started the book, I felt that for me, it had to be written from the heart. That was what I felt about this book. And so the journey very much includes places I know and love, and indeed it includes people that I've either noticed and wanted to imagine a bit more, or people I love. My children pop up in it. As I say, it was for my dad. So it starts in Kingsbridge, which is southern Devon, which is where my husband was brought up. And then, yes, it goes through lots of places I know. And if I didn't know them, I researched them. In England, we have a road map in the car. We haven't really quite got sat-nav in our car yet. And I had the road map, and I just started tearing out pages as I was writing the book. And I sort of began sellotaping them to my wall. And without really quite telling my husband what I was doing. And I had a phone call from him one afternoon, and he was stuck. And he said, "The map jumps from page 3 to 46. Is this anything to do with you?" And I did have to admit that it was indeed all over my wall. So I do know the route extremely well, is the point.
So we can expect walking tours.
Somebody said, wouldn't it be great? Harold Fry walks.
And Vaddey, although you went through many of these experiences, and certainly your own life story is very powerful, you chose to frame this as a novel. And there are some really interesting, I think, creative reasons for that that you talk about in your author note. And I would love to have you explain to the folks here sort of like the decision that went into doing a novel rather than a memoir about your experiences.
I wrote the story as a novel instead of a memoir because I didn't want it to be about my life, so to speak, which I felt a memoir could be mistaken for. First and foremost, when I took up the writing project, I wanted to honor the lives lost and those who made extraordinary, monumental sacrifices to save me. And I wanted to do it through art. For me, this meant that I must rely not only on memories, but imaginations and empathy to draw to the foreground an experience that I feel we all share as human beings, our hunger for life, our desire to live even in the face of death.
And Susannah, as you were trying to put your experiences into this memoir, were there other memoir writers that you sort of saw as a model or an inspiration for the ways that they were trying to frame their equally difficult experiences into a narrative?
Yeah, I really was inspired by The Night of the Gun because of that whole idea of he didn't remember and he's retracing, and what he remembered wasn't necessarily the truth, and what is the truth? That was a very important piece for me. I also I also felt very inspired by Girl Interrupted as well, because it's such a singular book. I mean, it's an iconic book about an experience, and I related to, though I was not in a psychiatric ward, I very much related to how she structured that book and her experiences throughout that book as well. So those two books were very important to me during the writing of it. And Joan Didion's A Year of Magical Thinking was also another very, very important book to me. And I would say those three books were.
And Antoine, I think place is a very important part of Panorama City as well. Oppen has like this very clear route that he goes on in his life, and it's time to say. And so if we were to go to Panorama City, would we be able to use Oppen's experiences as? Would we recognize the city there, or is there sort of a fictionalized version going on?
I think you would. Yeah, you would definitely recognize the elements of the city, the strip malls, the abandoned shopping carts, and certain demographic aspects of it. And I think because it's told through Oppen's wide-eyed point of view, there are a few moments in the story, for instance, with his girlfriend Carmen, who says, Madera, which is in Central California, which is the small town that he's from. She said, Madera is nice. Madera is families. Panorama City is gangs and lowlifes. Like, how can you possibly think this is a great place? Other people's opinions come into play. I suspect, like anywhere, both things exist. But you couldn't do a walking tour based on the turn-by-turn directions. But you'd recognize the place. I think I'm more and more trying to figure out how to reconcile fictional places with real places, and Los Angeles is a very challenging place to try to do that with. So I'm very interested in place, and I feel like it's a sort of problem that would continue to be rich and never be exactly solved, especially in 17 cities searching for a center, which is LA.
Great. And I want to open it up again to you folks. If there's anything that you want to ask our authors, just let me know. Show of hands. Okay. Yep, here we go.
My name is Brad Chowdhury. Susannah, how did you find Larry Wiseman?
How did I find Larry Weissman? I actually, what I recommend people do is look at books that they respect and like and see who represents them in the back when their acknowledgments, and I did that with his book Born to Run.
Larry, for those of you who don't know, is Susannah's agent, and a really great agent as well. So, other questions from the audience? Oh, there we go. And you've got a mic as well.
I just wanted to say that maybe you were there yesterday when your publishers or editors were speaking. They did a great job of selling your books. I recommend all 6 of them.
Thank you. Other comments or questions from folks? Oh, okay. First you, and then I'll come back to you.
Susannah, after you were diagnosed, how long did it take for you to recover?
I'm sorry. Oh, it took, that's a very complicated question because I would say when I went back to work, I was in the hospital in April, and then in September, I went back to work, and I would have said then, I'm back, I'm fine, but it really took another 8 months for me to actually be back to who I am now, I would say. So, a year and a half, I would say.
I have a quick question for Rachel. Without giving anything away, me asking the question or you answering it, did you know when you started writing the book if Harold would make it or not to his destination? And when, in the course of writing it, did you know how it would end?
I felt it was very important. I knew right from the beginning what would happen to Harold Fry, but as in life, Harold doesn't know what's going to happen to Harold Fry. And neither does the reader. And I thought if the reader and Harold don't know, and I do, we're probably in, I hope, in a pretty good place.
Great. Any next question? Next question? Here we go.
Susannah, can you talk a little bit about all the people, I know a lot of people contacted you when they heard about your disease, who felt that they were suffering from something similar. Can you talk about that experience and some of those people?
I wrote a piece for the New York Post when I got back to the Post in October of 2009. Yes, 2009. And following that, I got so many emails and amazing emails. And one such story was probably the most striking story that happened was a father who called me about his daughter who was actually in a psychiatric ward diagnosed with schizophrenia. And they saw me, and I was on the Today Show as well, and they saw my article, and through a series of the doctors are still so, sadly they just don't know about this disease, and she still went several months. But after they saw me on the Today Show and the Post article, she was ultimately diagnosed, and now she's 100% back to college, and that was probably the most amazing experience with this whole thing.
Great. Next.
Hi, this is the editors asking their authors questions portion of the event. Antoine, you and I have talked about this before, but I was wondering if you could speak to, you have said before that this book has asked many things of you through the course of its writing and its coming about, and I wondered if you could speak to that at all. What it has asked of you at different stages.
I think this was more than anything else I've ever written. This is something that, in the process of writing it, I sort of felt my way there over and over and over again, and so the actual writing of the book was very difficult because I felt for a long chunk of it like I was in the woods, with a compass and a gun, and somewhere out there was a bear. But eventually, the actual publishing process also sort of serendipitously asked a lot of me. There were a number of road bumps along the way and different things that kept happening, and I felt like at every turn I had to kind of double down on Up and Porter and Panorama City, and I felt like I had to, even when I felt like in my gut like things were not going to turn out, I had to keep sort of seeing things and how they were going to look a year down the line in the writing and in the publication process and everything. So it's very rewarding to see him finally going out into the world and hopefully finding some readers.
And I'm going to jump. Oh, wait, here we go.
I can't not ask Vaddey a question. Vaddey, one of the things that fascinates me about your book is that you wrote it without, I think you said you took one creative writing class in college, and then you wrote this novel completely by yourself. And I just find that an amazing thing to do. Are there writers that you read that you loved, or how did you do that?
Well, Mike Ondaatje, I absolutely adore him. He's up there on my pantheon of gods. I've always had a clear vision how I wanted to write this book, even though I know that I cannot escape, so to speak, the story of the killing fields. I wanted to capture the Cambodia before it became the killing field. And so in order to do this, I needed to kind of imbue the storytelling with the lyricism of my native tongue. And I feel that no one else understands that better than I did. And I took time with it. I feel that perhaps taking a writing class or studying writing formally would introduce too much interference just in terms of how I want to express this story. I want the writing itself to carry the reader through the story from the beginning to the end, even though I know it is a hard story to absorb in terms of its political context.
Do I have time for one more? Okay, so we have time for one more question, and I'm sorry, I'm actually going to jump in and ask another group question for everybody, which is for each of you to tell me about the last great book that you read that you would recommend to other people.
I've just read Jeanette Winterson's memoir, which I really loved, and I think it's very interesting about the process of writing as it is about memory and time. So I really recommend that.
I finished reading Embers by Sandor Marai. It's by a Hungarian writer. I think it's as perfect as a book could be, just in terms of plotting, pace, language. One of the things that I was very conscious of in terms of writing my own book was that I want the language to be simple. I want this story to be something that someone like my mother could read, and Embers for me was a real example. The language was just so simple and yet so poetic and lyrical.
What has been so comforting to me during this time when you're finishing a book has been this book that's kind of in the canon of books that you have to read when you're writing a book. It's Bird by Bird. And I've reread that a few times, and I think that that's one of the most comforting and wonderful books that you can possibly read when you're in the middle of writing anything, and I would highly recommend that.
Two books, Leaving the Atocha Station by Ben Lerner, which has been praised to the skies in other places, and Dancing Lessons for the Advanced in Age, which was put out by New York Review of Books. It's by Bohumil Hrabal, Hrabal. I'll never say it right, but his work really helped me find my way back in the middle of Panorama City, and I was delighted to discover that crazy single-sentence, weirdo, funny book.
Cool. Well, thank you for those recommendations, and thank you, all four of you as well, for your very powerful books, which are coming out later this summer and early fall. I encourage each of you to track down all four of these books, as well as the other two Buzz books. And you can learn a little bit more about the Buzz books as well with a wrap-up of yesterday's panel that was in Shelf Awareness. I hope you'll check that out with talks from the editors. And so thank you again to Rachel Joyce, Vaddey Ratner, Susannah Cahalan, and Antoine Wilson. And thank you to BookExpo America for hosting this Buzz Author event. Have a good afternoon.